I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Right at the start of the debate, when this bill was introduced, Labor said that it would support the Victims' Orders Against Violent Offenders Bill, and the reason for that was pretty clear-cut. We need to have a system that pays more attention to the victim. Sadly, in relation to serious violent and sexual offending, there are far too many victims. It's time, actually, to produce some fundamental change in the way our system works, to try to build more fences at the top of the cliff rather than to try to do small repair jobs at the bottom. Frankly, the bill as introduced was pretty weak. My colleague Carol Beaumont has referred to the regulatory impact statement. And, Minister, I was kind of astounded to read in the regulatory impact statement that the best estimate of your officials was that this bill might deal with 10 cases a year. 10 cases a year? We're talking about thousands of cases of sexual and violent offending each year and the victims that arise from that. Each year, hundreds, maybe thousands of people are let out of prison and there wasn't protection for the victims in particular circumstances. Minister, you'll recall that the origin of this bill was a case in Invercargill where a woman was raped, her offender was convicted, he was sentenced to prison, he served prison, he was let out of prison, as happens at the end of your sentence or when you're released, and he moved in next door to the victim. The victim was absolutely powerless. Every day she faced the risk of confronting the man who had sexually violated her, and there was nothing she could do about it. And that apparently was what caused this bill to be introduced. The difficulty with the bill when it was introduced, we found that it would have had no application at all to the woman whose case sparked the need for the legislation. And why was that? Because in order to have the protection of the non-contact order, the offender had to be jailed to at least 5 months imprisonment. He had been jailed for 5 years. He had been jailed for 4 years. No protection in this bill for the very person that it purported to protect. So that was a huge weakness. We indicated at the first reading of the bill that that was utterly inadequate, that we would fight to get that changed. In the Select Committee, they moved it to 3 years, and after a discussion with the Minister, personally, she agreed to move it to 2 years. And I think 2 years is appropriate. It brings it in line with the definition under the Parole Act, which demarcates a serious from a less serious offence. But there are other important changes that we made in this legislation that will strengthen it, that are set out in Part 2. And the first is that the way the bill was introduced once again meant that you could not get a non-contact order until the offender had been released from the prison. Now, that was pretty dumb, because that meant that there was always going to be a gap between the release from prison and the victim being able to get a non-contact order. In fact, the victim would not always know that the offender had been released and there was real risk in it. So we made, I think, a very sensible change in the committee that you can get a non-contact order at any time after the offender has been sentenced. That was a sensible move. The other area of weakness that we addressed was really came out of the submissions that the Select Committee heard, and that was that some offenders were reasonably cunning in the way they sought to re-victimise their victims. They didn't do it themselves, but they got an associate to do it. So what we've put into this bill is a provision that will allow the non-contact order to apply to people other than the offender. And we've put reasonably strong safeguards in there in order to have a non-contact order made out against a person who was not the offender. They need, one, to have been encouraged by the offender to engage in the behaviour that is being prohibited. Two, they need to have engaged in those kinds of behaviour. And third, the person's behaviour has been and continues to be detrimental to the victim's ability to manage the effects of the offending. So there were three key weaknesses in this legislation that we have addressed, and I think the legislation is better for it. But I want to come back to the point that I made, Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Bill Goff.
I want to come back to the point that I made at the beginning. You know, we won't be just dealing with 10 cases a year now. Maybe we'll be dealing with scores of cases, but the number is still pretty small. What we actually need is a substantial piece of legislation if we're truly to protect the interests of the victims. You know, I found out from a victims organisation in West Auckland, indeed the Chief Executive has just been acknowledged in the Honours List this year, that maybe 1 in 100 cases of sexual violation is the offender actually charged, convicted and sentenced to prison. 1 in 100, Mr Chairman. 1 in 100 means that 99% of the victims are not seeing justice done. And we've helped by helping another 0.05% of the victims. Worth doing in specific cases because there is a gap in the legislation where people are not covered by the Domestic Violence Act, they can't get a protection order, they're not covered by the Harassment Act, they can't get a restraining order. We do address the gap, but we do not address the problem. And the problem lies in a number of areas. In part, it is a case of protection. And we've just done the estimates on police to find out that 5 years in a row, the police budget has been cut in real terms, cut by $114 million. Now, if we want to protect victims, cutting the police budget, cutting police staff and closing police stations doesn't appear to be a very good way of doing it. So we're doing a mildly good thing here, but not offsetting a very bad thing that the government is doing by reducing protection to victims by cutting the police budget. Secondly, you need attitude change, and that's not short-term. That's the change that we can make through our education system. There needs to be a concerted effort, and I don't think anybody in the House would be opposed to that sort of education program being run and more effective programs for those in prison that are guilty of violent offending. But the third area, and I really want the Minister to address this, because if this bill is about protecting victims, then we've got to face up to the fact that we have a system that's not designed to protect victims. We have a system that is adversarial. We have a system where still, even after various changes in legislation, the victim feels that they are being re-victimised in court. The victim doesn't want to go to court. The victim feels that they are going to be re-victimised because of this adversarial system. And I guess the question that I have to the Minister is why she is so opposed to changing the system in its fundamentals to having a more inquisitorial system that is better designed to protect the interests and to get to the truth to help the victim themselves. I'd have to ask the question about why we aren't doing more in the area of restorative justice, because a number of rape survivors that I've talked to said are actually not interested in 20 years sentence for the offender. They simply want an expression of remorse, of contrition, to confront the offender, to actually hear the offender admit that he was wrong in what he did. Now, that doesn't seem enough to me in terms of a person that has been a victim in that way. But it's a hell of a lot more, Minister, than what they're getting out of the present system. Because in the present system, I come back to the statistics, 99 out of 100 victims of sexual violation are not going to see justice done. And while this piece of legislation is a very small help, it pales into insignificance compared to the nature of the problem that we should be addressing in this legislature. This is not enough, Mr Chairman. We need to do a lot more. Mr Chairman, in terms of the actual provisions of the bill, I've outlined the key provisions where I think we have made changes that were necessary so that this legislation would at least have some real practical effect. Mr Chairman, I think we have closed the gap that we are talking about, but we have not resolved the problem. That's why I asked the Minister not simply to bring a series of minor pieces of legislation to the House. We'll always support any piece of legislation that will enhance and promote the interests of victims, but to do something that will really make a difference to the overwhelming majority and the too many people who fall victim to serious sexual and violent offending.
Mr. Chairman.
I call the honourable member Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to take a call.
Member Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.